Okay, so what I'm going to try and do, I have a meeting at 1 o'clock, so I'm going to try and go about 35 minutes with this presentation, take some questions, and then hopefully you'll find this to be somewhat interesting. I don't know if everybody on the call will have opportunity to use this software, but sometimes it's useful to know how this works. So why am I talking about SciENcv? SciENcv has been around for quite a while. It's one of the several NCBI resources that are at the public's disposal. Its main utility is to help prepare a biosketch for folks who are going to be applying to originally an NIH award grant application, but it's also more recently become the default and the required tool for other federal agency grant applications. And as I go forward, you'll see in the biosketch generator what components get added to this. The reason why it's important and has become more important recently is that, as you will see as I go through the slides, the tools which are in the My NCBI dashboard are really what drives a lot of the information which gets automatically added to the SciENcv template. And as I go forward these screens, you'll see why this all becomes important and links back to PubMed and connecting to citations and bringing the relevant citations into this CV and demonstrating to the NIH that here are certain publications which this applicant finds to be their most relevant to the application that we're submitting or the grant that we're actually competing for. So it's going to be a required tool for the NSF awards come June 2020. So earlier last month, I did a couple of these presentations for the grants managers that are in the science libraries over on the Cambridge side. There was also a request to do it here on the Longwood campus for the grants managers here who work with both NIH and NSF grants collaboratively with folks around Harvard and the affiliated hospitals. So here we go. I'm going to go through these slides now, if I can make sure that my screen is activated. This series of slides is targeted at the grants administrators who work for principal investigators at the various departments and labs around campus and the affiliated hospitals. So some of these screens I get to might be talking to that audience, but I begin here showing them what most of them will come into first, and that's seeing the SciENcv login. And again, as I'll mention here, SciENcv is actually one branch of all these different tools which are in the suite of NCBI resources. So folks who have not worked with the NCBI tools before, which sometimes is commonly the case. They might first interact with SciENcv before even going to PubMed or going to the NCBI dashboard. So they'll end up at this particular page. Scenario might be this new grants administrators. They were told we need to put together a biosketch for this NIH application or this NSF application. Please go create a CV in the SciENcv tool. And so they might come here straight to SciENcv and they'll want to click start, and then they will get to a particular page which will have them log in. So there's several login options here. Some of our grants administrators and PIs, they already will have what's called this ERA Commons login. The ERA tool is it's an administrative program that is at the NIH, and it's something which is used to manage a lot of the grant activity when it's been awarded or when you're initially applying. But you have to have a specific account in that system. Most of the people who will need to put together a CV, they will not yet have an account. So their route of entry is going to be through this NCBI login, because here anybody in the public domain, anybody in the public can actually set up an NCBI login. So if they already have one, great. If not, they will they'll have to set one up and go through some of the basic questions that anyone gets asked when you set up a new online account. If they came straight to the main NCBI dashboard, they would hit this page here, the NCBI tool is, as most of you know online, here is many different suite of databases, resources, and tools. No matter how it goes, if you just set up one NCBI account, it's going to be good for all of these particular products. So here I was showing an example of hitting PubMed first, then clicking on sign into my NCBI in the upper right. And so this particular character that you see the username as Kleinzak, let's think of this particular person as a grants administrator, somebody who is actually in the role of helping various professors and PIs in a given lab. So this particular grants administrator, Kleinzak, could log in this way. They will get into their dashboard, or one could log in with a third-party login. ORCID is also a really great way to log in to the NCBI tools, and I'll show why that's useful in a few slides downstream. So anyway, once this particular person logs in, they get to their main NCBI dashboard, and as many of you know, this will keep track of our recent PubMed search activity. We can save searches, we can set up alerts. Over here on the right is what we're interested in this conversation, the My Bibliography section, as well as SciENcv. The reason why the My Bibliography piece is really central to this conversation is because the citations that go into the My Bibliography for a given PI, that is what will inform the important sections of the biosketch that needs to be generated in SciENcv. So whenever I have these conversations with the different departments, the first thing I need to make sure they're familiar with is this My Bibliography tool, because that is really where the rubber hits the road. The SciENcv tool does not really operate in this vacuum. It's going to be communicating with the bibliography here, or the bibliography that might be in an ORCID profile, but more commonly this bibliography here that is in the My Bibliography tool. This is where the citations need to be added for them to be used in the various sections that will be in the biosketch we create in SciENcv. So I start this presentation by getting into how do we use My Bibliography, and more importantly, how do different PIs set up delegate access to this grants administrator, in this case, this person called Kleinzak. So as you can see, when Kleinzak logged in here, they have access to the one PI, Zach Kohane, and they also have access to this other PI, Paul Lapinski, who has a testing account created for him in this particular role. So in these two delegated bibliographies to this person, these would be principal investigators who may be applying for new awards in the future. They may have progress reports that are due. And in both cases, whether it's a progress report to an active grant or a biosketch that's being created for some new award we're competing for, this is where the citations are kept in these individual bibliographies for the various PIs and professors. So moving forward, again, in the upper right, I can see who is currently logged in. So here it is, again, the grants administrator. And again, thinking about this My NCBI dashboard as really the hub, which is going to communicate with these other tools. The other tool, which is not featured here, which this dashboard will help us get to and work with, is what's called the NIH Manuscript Submission System. That manuscript submission system is where researchers will upload their articles that need to go into a digital repository at PubMed Central. PubMed Central is a digital archive that the NIH has that houses all of the open access articles which are on deposit there because of any number of these open access policies that the federal government has. The NIH public access policy being the main one that we work with here at the Countway and helping our professors stay in compliance with. That whole tool is managed also from within this NCBI account. So it's a really, really powerful hub to think about in how we manage not only these two tools here, My Bibliography and SciENcv, but also how we get the scholarship into the required digital repository at the NIH so that the faculty and the researchers and these grants can remain in compliance with those public access policies. All right, so in this particular conversation, again, we're going to focus on these two tools, My Bibliography and SciENcv. So let's talk about my bibliography. So in this case here, I have clicked on the My Bibliography, and I kind of wish they used some other name, but anyway, the My Bibliography of the grants administrator, in this case, Kleinzak. I click on 35 items right there, and I'm actually viewing Kleinzak's personal bibliography. Notice there's nothing over here in this particular right margin, and keep that in mind when I get to the next few examples. But this particular person is not a PI. This is somebody who's working for the professors and the PIs of various grants. And notice in the upper right here, underneath their name, they have access to 3 other bibliographies. Well, one of which, 1.3, is their own. And when they click on that down arrow, they can toggle over to one of the other bibliographies that they manage. So again, Paul Lapinski, Zach Kohane, they granted delegate access to Kleinzak to work with their bibliographies when need be. So the question is, maybe they have to work on Paul Lapinski's bibliography. So Kleinzak has just toggled over to this PI's bibliography. And now notice in the right-hand column, we can see very interesting information. We can see that the citations added to this list may or may not be in compliance with public access policies. Over on the right, I can see that this first citation is perfectly good, has a PMC ID number that indicates to the NIH that this paper is deposited in PubMed Central, made freely available to the world because of the public access mandate that the NIH has for awardees. If the awardee has worked with an NIH grant and a particular publication is acknowledging one of the grants that PI is in charge of, then that paper must be made freely available. So this paper here, this first paper, was supported by one, or in this case, 4 separate NIH or NSF awards, and therefore it must have this PubMed Central ID number to demonstrate compliance with the public access policy. We need to make sure that these are compliant before they go into the SciENcv. So bringing the citations into this list would help the grants administrator and PI discover ahead of time whether or not one of these papers needs to be addressed for compliance reasons. Perhaps this second paper might need to be deposited into PubMed Central. Using this particular list gives me a way to get ahead of the curve and figure out what do I have to try and get into that public access repository at the NIH, so that when that SciENcv biosketch goes into my application, everything is looking good and everything is compliant, and the application does not get stalled. The progress report does not get stalled for these non-compliant problems. So this is a place where the grants administrator can come. They can add some citations to this list. Again, here I am back at the grants administrator's view of their personal bibliography. And here I jumped over to Zach's bibliography to look at a few of the citations for compliance purposes in his list. So if I want to add new citations, perhaps there's a new biosketch I need to put together or a new grant application that's due in the next few weeks. By clicking on Add Citations, I have a few options. I could manually type in some citation information. That's usually used if the publication might have been in a journal that is not indexed automatically in PubMed, or is not even indexed in anywhere, perhaps. So if I have, maybe it's a conference proceeding, maybe it's something that was in some white paper that I was on a committee at a major, maybe the World Health Organization. I could enter any of these contributions to scholarship manually if need be. But if there is a citation in PubMed, which is 9 out of 10 times going to be the case for these examples, I can click on let's add something from PubMed. Actually, this example here is showing a case where the journal does not appear in PubMed. I think when I put these slides together, I was initially showing this to some of the grants administrators at the science libraries, and their example was in some engineering journal that was not indexed in PubMed. But this manual entry form here that you see gives me an opportunity to enter pretty much anything that is not indexed in PubMed. If I do want to search PubMed first, I can click on that, let's add a citation from PubMed. And then I'm presented with this little search box. I have it magnified here on this particular screen. I could type in the author's name, And then I can find a recent publication by this particular author. I know everybody's giggling right now to find Scott working on an article that deals with alcohol consumption. We'll save the story for that another time. It's one of those articles that says drinking alcohol is actually good for your health. I like these ones. So anyway, we pulled this one up from PubMed. And to add this to my bibliography, we just check off the box, click Add to Bibliography, and then the citation is then added to the list of citations in this particular PI's list. Shows that it's compliant, and so that's all great. So now, how did a person gain access to the delegate role? As you can see on this screen here, I'll go back to, from the bibliography, when we click on the user identity in the upper right, that will bring us to a place where we can choose the account settings. And in the account settings, there's an option to add delegates. So whoever is added to the delegate list will have access to update the bibliography, but also update and work with the SciENcv. I could turn these on or off accordingly based on the delegate's role. So I wanted to add a new delegate to this particular list. So I added Robin over at the Science Libraries to my list of delegates who can work with my particular bibliography. And then what happens is Robin would get an email indicating that, in this case, Kleinzak wants to make you, Robin, a delegate to my bibliography. So again, I'm not a PI, but anybody can make anyone a delegate to access their own personal bibliography or SciENcv. And so what would have to happen is Robin will have received an email from, in this case, Kleinzak. Robin has to click on that, accept the delegate responsibility, log into her NCBI account. And then once that happens, I would have the option to turn on or off the options so that she could see my bibliography or SciENcv. And then once a person comes in as a delegate, again, you'll see the delegated bibliographies in the upper right of this particular person's NCBI dashboard. So again, now I'm logged in as the PI. So the PI has to log in order to make new delegates available or allowed to access their account. So in this case, Paul Lapinski logged in, clicked on account settings, and here you can see there's a number of people that have delegate access and different roles. Again, here I clicked on add a new delegate, added Tina over at the Science Libraries. She too will receive confirmation request. And as soon as she accepts that, then she would have access to get into my, in this case, Paul Lapinski's SciENcv. And so this is what it would look like for a delegate. So again, we talked about the My Bibliography in full. Moving on to the SciENcv side. For a SciENcv, again, this person, this administrative assistant, could very easily create CVs, SciENcvs and biosketches for themselves, or I could toggle over to the PI's SciENcv account by clicking on the delegated CV there. And so now I am in the PI's dashboard. It indicates to me that I'm working as a delegate for this particular PI. And so I'll see some of the PI's information in the first header information here. And then I can see various biosketches that had been created in the past. And you might want to have different biosketches for different purposes. And it will be kind of just common workflow that certain biosketches are going to highlight certain areas of expertise of different labs and PIs. There's a limit to the number of citations you can add in a particular biosketch. So their goal will be to choose the most relevant 5 or 6. I think it's less than 10 now. I think it's only about 5. But what are the most relevant publications to this particular grant application that I need to highlight in my CV? And so this is why it's going to be important to have multiple biosketches over time, because we'll obviously be highlighting different aspects, different articles that we might have published over the course of our career. So again, PIs don't like to do this kind of tedious work, so the delegate is going to get started here. Create a new biosketch. And so there's a couple of different options to get started. The BioSketch, we give it some sort of relevant name. And here we choose the general layout. So each of these is the required template for these different agencies, the different roles as well, whether it's a fellowship application, maybe some other broader NIH grant, NSF grants. And so we would choose what our end goal is going to be for the BioSketch format. And then we can start in a variety of different ways here. So we could start completely blank. We could have this blank template and just type in everything manually. Or we could work from a pre-existing BioSketch that we used and change a few fields here and there. I'll show an example of working with an ORCID data source, which would automatically bring in a lot of our ORCID profile information to populate the BioSketch fields where relevant. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the sharing private and public in a little while. Let's see, I'm going to do a quick time check here, 12:23. Let me keep moving forward. Okay, so so the next screen here actually shows what would happen if I just chose a blank BioSketch. So I did not choose ORCID here in this example. I chose a blank BioSketch. It brought over very, very bare bones information. It took in my name, and that's about it. And so I use this as an example of where we would end up if we chose nothing at all. If I had chose a BioSketch that I had worked on maybe last year, at this location, I would have several of these fields already filled out. I might even have the personal statement completely filled out from some previous application, and I could edit a few things here and there. So it's really useful to have these templates where we can build off of. In the other example here, I chose ORCID as an external source. And what it does is if we choose ORCID as the external source, it goes off to ORCID. My particular BioSketch, I'm sorry, my SciENcv was already configured to connect to my ORCID account. And so I'll show you how that actually is done in some of the final slides when I get to the end of the run here. But there's a one-time process where you can tell your SciENcv account to map directly to a particular ORCID account, and then it will bring in the information that it discovers in the ORCID profile. So this brought in my ORCID number here, which is also becoming a required field in many grant applications, as well as publishers' requirements when we have a manuscript reviewed before publication. So either way, in this case here, we started the BioSketch with the ORCID-based data. And what this does is when we get down to various fields, as you can see, this particular tab, a personal statement would come up here. I would obviously type in some prose about my research areas, my interests, and where I hope to go with this particular project. But I'm also allowed to choose relevant citations in this section A. And this is where the connection back to my bibliography for this PI or the connection back to the ORCID profile becomes so important. I don't have to enter these 100 times for every application or every form or every progress report that I do with these agencies. The fact that it connects back to whatever scholarship is in my ORCID account or whatever scholarship I listed in that my bibliography, I can just select the citations from the connection that's being made, and they're brought directly into the SciENcv BioSketch here. So this is important in the section A of the BioSketch for the personal statement. And then further down, there's a section C, which is called Contributions to Science. And here also in the BioSketch, we would select accordingly the citations we want to include in this particular BioSketch. So as you can see here, it says we can choose up to 5 contributions. And so I chose one down there. And maybe a couple more from ORCID as contributions to science. There is also a section down here in section D. Again, not having applied to any of these grants, I'm not too sure what else would go in here, but either way, the information that is being mapped to from these other accounts saves a lot of the otherwise manual typing that I would have to do each time I need to put together a BioSketch. So the ORCID configuration, that's easy enough to set up as well. So when we come to our SciENcv dashboard, and we're at the that header information of the scholar, whoever is the owner of this SciENcv account. There's just a simple little edit button over on the right, and that allows us to connect our ORCID ID to this particular SciENcv account. And when we do that, it pushes off to ORCID, asks us to log in one time at ORCID with our ORCID credentials, and then it prompts us with an authorization screen. Once we authorize that, it makes the connection to ORCID and makes a bridge to SciENcv. What's happening on this screen, though, is I've come back to my main biosketch that I'm working on for this example. So I have a slightly different name over here for it. But anyway, the idea is I finally want to put together that PDF formatted in the required layout for this particular grant template. And I think I had used the NIH biosketch template. I had pressed on the PDF link that we see right over here, and it cranks up a file for download. And just like that, it lays out the biosketch. This is the upper half, the personal statement. I put a couple of citations in. The PMC ID number is clearly visible for the reviewers. Further down the same biosketch, I have the contributions to science lining up. And sometimes the review committee, or depending on the purpose or what kind of application or progress report it might be, we sometimes have to make a publicly shareable URL to access this very same biosketch. And so when I started to create this SciENcv biosketch for this particular purpose, I had the sharing set to private. As I said, sometimes the reviewer will say, we would like you to make your biosketch publicly available. Please provide us with a URL. And so I'll have to sometimes work with the grants administrators to show them how to activate this as a public CV and use this URL as the what's the word I'm looking for? The standard consistent URL that they can then send to the reviewers so they can access this directly. But that does have to be turned on in some cases. And then when they're finished, they can clean up. If some of these older biosketches are getting out of date, there is a button here which said edit. In this example, I had already clicked on edit, and then that allows me to either delete these biosketches, go back into them, change the name perhaps, make a few updates to some of the fields, create a new one. We already talked about that. And that's a whirlwind tour of creating biosketches in SciEncv.